He looked normal. Motivation wasn't about killing itself, but about control, fear, and the process. He was a Boy Scout. He later became an Air Force radar mysterious stories, because you never know, maybe your town will be next.
Every town has a dark side.